On the topic of potential injury to the head, my main reference is Australian football. And when I think about sitting there with my dad as a kid and watching AFL, I remember maybe just one footballer in the league wearing any kind of head protection. And I see the way the game is played in America, and people wear helmets. It's probably a naive question, but why would American football pose a particular risk?
Okay, well, first, from standpoint of the helmet can help decrease the impact. However, the exact role it plays in decreasing the rate of concussion is not quite as clear, because when the head is struck by another object or another body, there's a rotational acceleration that occurs, and that will happen regardless if you have a helmet on it. Now, there is a potential for helmets to prevent the cumulative long-term effects of multiple blows to the head over time. Now, in football, football is a tough sport, similar to boxing. Boxing is another sport where there's multiple impacts to the head, and which increases the risk of potential neurological impairment.
What actually happens in the brain? I think the danger that occurs is connected to concussion. What actually happens in the brain when concussion occurs?
The concussion occurs, there's a sort of electrochemical, mechanical disconnection. There's multiple cascades that are initiated at the time of a concussion, which includes changes in neurotransmitters, changes in ionic gradients, changes in energy function. So it's very complicated. But the primary mechanism, as I mentioned before, is rotational acceleration. It's sort of that spinning of the head that causes the concussion.
And what's happening in the brain when that happens?
When that happens, you have stretching of axons, which are the sleeves of the nerves, and these can tear on a microscopic level and causing chemical changes within the brain.
Dr. Jordan, in your capacity working with American football players as a neurologist, what have you seen? What has been an average trajectory for players who have an injury like this?
Okay, in terms of concussion that we see in football and other contact collision sports, sometimes it can be difficult to diagnose, because sometimes the findings can be subtle. It also depends upon the athlete coming to the trainer or to the doctor and informing them. But the majority of sports-related concussions do not involve loss of consciousness. Probably less than 5% of concussions involve loss of consciousness. So it's important to do a detailed evaluation. From my experience, that gives you the most information. And I start with simple questions, just like orientation. Where are we today? How'd you get here? Who you're playing? What's the name of the team? Who you played last week? There's certain questions like that. And sometimes you'd be surprised at the answers that you receive, because sometimes they may not remember. I've had an athlete one time, was actually a boxer, who probably sustained a concussion in the ring and didn't remember anything previous that day except for having breakfast. He had no recollection of how he got to the arena. And then the next thing he realized, he had awakened in the hospital the next day.
With this situation, Dr. Jordan, I know that the matter of concussion and this phenomena of CTE, that really came under the spotlight in 2013 with this documentary that revealed how often this is happening for NFL players.
It's a fairly complicated issue. When you look at brain injury in sports, there's two general areas. There's what we call the acute traumatic brain injury and the chronic traumatic brain injury. The acute brain injury is the concussion. The chronic brain injuries that we see related to sports is called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, but there are some other conditions that may also be related directly or indirectly to cumulative effects of blows to the head, such as Parkinsonism. There's been some speculation that even Alzheimer's disease could be attributed to multiple head traumas, not necessarily just sports, but head traumas in general.
I'm aware of a study that has recently come out. I believe it was conducted by Boston University, and this indicated that there was as much as a 60% increased likelihood for people who had played American football at a competitive level of developing Parkinson's disease later in life. What is your reaction to that?
Well, there are some limitations to the study, but overall, it's not surprising simply because earlier boxing studies suggested that boxers who developed what we call dementia pugilistica, which is a severe end-stage form of chronic traumatic encephalopathy that occurs in boxers. The part of the brain that's involved with Parkinson's and was often involved in these individuals that went to autopsy and were found to have chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and they also had evidence of Parkinsonism.
If someone has an acute injury that results in CET, what is ahead of them?
It's difficult to say. We don't know enough yet in terms of how progressive the condition is. There are some individuals that may progress. There's some that don't progress. There may be a genetic predisposition to it, because not all athletes that play contact collision sports develop CTE. So there must be some other variables that's also involved. We did a study probably over 20 years ago now where we looked at football players and boxers, and we found that they had a particular gene, the same gene that increases your risk for Alzheimer's disease. If they had that gene, there was an interaction of that gene with exposure or age. But what I mean by that, if you had this gene and you boxed or played football for a long time or you were older, you might have more neurological impairment.
Given that these are risk factors with the presence of this gene, but I wonder more generally, exposure and playing the game at an older age, what might be done to prevent the onset of CTE and potentially Parkinson's?
There are some studies that suggest that kids that start out at an early age playing contact collision sports may be at a higher risk. Most people say that if they start before the age of 12, they may be at higher risk. I think more studies need to be conducted to demonstrate that. But from the logical standpoint, it makes sense. The longer you participate in a sport, the higher the risk are that you may have neurological impairment. So if you take an athlete that, say, starts competitive sports at the age of 8 or 9 or 10, and then they play, say, Pop Warner football, then they play high school football, they play college football, and then they go to play professional football, that's a long time to experience trauma to the brain. So I think that exposure is really the most important issue.
What would you say to a parent whose child is interested in, maybe around the age of 12, who's interested in getting into football?
So proper instruction is important. I believe that if you have limited exposure, so someone plays a little high school sports, high school football, maybe some Pop Warner football or high school soccer, and plays for, say, this is just hypothetical, like say 5 years, it's unlikely they're going to probably have any long-term consequences. I think it's the athlete that participates for a longer period of time is the one that has higher risk. But if someone is at higher risk, that does not mean that they're going to definitely develop it. Because there are athletes that play a long time and are doing quite well neurologically. So there's still a lot we don't know or understand about this condition.